Hi everyone, this is Scott. For maps, references, and images for each episode, as well as links to all my social media, please go to ancientworldpodcast.com. And if you'd like to support the show, please go to patreon.com/theancientworld. Thanks again for listening. In our last episode on Mesopotamia, we talked about the northern cities of Mari and Ebla. In addition to trade, agriculture, and fighting each other, these cities had one more preoccupation: maintaining massive herds of sheep for wool production. In the first half of the 3rd millennium, Mari and Ebla, along with other major northern cities like Urkesh and Nawar, sponsored the development of settler communities all throughout the broad, semi-productive steppe zone between the upper Euphrates and the Anatolian foothills. These communities relied on subsistence agriculture and devoted their energies and most of their land to pasturing large herds of sheep. Aaron A. Burke defines a zone of uncertainty stretching from the Zagros foothills across northern Mesopotamia and Syria and down into Canaan, which he creatively christens the Fragile Crescent. The unifying trait across this zone was the precarious potential for farming and herding at the limits of rain-fed agriculture, which was most definitely the case in northern Syria. But since the climate at the time was particularly propitious, and the commodities generated, mainly sheep's wool, greatly in demand, these settler communities thrived, selling wool to their mother cities, who then traded on to Mesopotamia. Over the course of centuries, these rural enclaves began to realize that they had more in common with one another in terms of environment, economics, social conditions, and material culture than they had with their own mother cities. Per Burke, this shared affinity expressed itself in the adoption of common burial practices, common settlement planning and defenses, and the widespread use of direct access in Antis temple architecture. The design, which allowed a more direct approach to the god, or at least, their cult statue, mirrored the fact that Syrian society was far less dependent on priests. Even as the culture became more uniform, a kaleidoscope of dialects, traditions, and ancestral gods were maintained just below the surface, reflecting the settlers' diverse origins. Regardless of how they defined themselves, the people living in these rural communities were soon referred to by a common term in contemporary Sumerian texts, the Martu, meaning Westerner, otherwise known as the Amorites. The term was meant to distinguish the population of these settler communities from that of their mother cities. And it wasn't just used in the south. The term Amorite also appears in texts from the northern city of Ebla. In some ways, the distinction made sense. Amorite communities had their own leaders and their own social and political organizations that were largely outside the contemporary city-state structure. Per Burke, they appear to have occupied a unique socioeconomic niche within and between the territorial claims of the northern Mesopotamian polities. Amorites had their own ens or rulers, as well as councils of elders, who negotiated boundaries among themselves and trade deals with their respective mother cities. In ways we don't quite understand, some Amorite objects carried potent political heft. Burke reports that Eblaite kings exchanged so-called Martu daggers when making treaties with Mari. By 2500, dozens, perhaps hundreds, of Amorite communities were dispersed throughout this zone of uncertainty. One prominent cluster was located in the hinterlands to the east and west of the upper Euphrates, in the broad vicinity of Carchemish. The fragile crescent the Amorites worked wasn't just fragile due to its marginal climate, it was also sensitive to conflict. As Burke notes, in the second half of the third millennium, frequent hostilities between Mari and Ebla, and occasional allies like Kish and Nagar, introduced a high degree of instability to the markets of the region. This shared hardship also became another source of powerful Amorite bonding. So, as we head back down to Sumer, let's all remember that there's a huge population up in the north that's living a life on the edge. One that could probably do without any more major shocks. Okay, so when we left things off, Lugal-Zaggisi had just destroyed the northern city of Ebla. Oh, whoops, sorry Amorites. He'd also gained control of pretty much all the lands of Mesopotamia and Syria, including his newly adopted capital of Uruk and the important central Mesopotamian city of Kish. The king of Kish was named Ur-Zababa, and after his defeat, he was apparently allowed to retain his throne as a vassal of Lugal-Zaggisi. As it happened, Ur-Zababa had a royal cupbearer whom we'll call Mr. X. I mean, we know for sure that his name wasn't Sargon, since Sharu-Kenu means legitimate king, and it's pretty unlikely that Ur-Zababa would let that kind of thing slide. According to legend, Mr. X was the illegitimate son of a temple priestess, who, unable to keep him, had set him adrift on the Euphrates. He was rescued by Aki, overseer of the canals at Kish, who raised him up as his own son. If there's truth to the legend, the upbringing would have given Mr. X experience in organizing and managing large groups of canal workers, who, in the days before standing armies, would have also served in the military. Over time, he advanced to the role of cupbearer, second only to the king. Now, cupbearer Mr. X was having trouble sleeping. When questioned why by Ur-Zababa, he related that, in his dreams, there was an extraordinary young woman, high as the sky, wide as the world, standing strong as a fortress wall. To me, it seemed as if she drowned me in a river of blood. The girl in his dreams was clearly Inanna, the Sumerian goddess of war and carnal love, known to the Semites as Ishtar. A little freaked out by the godly attention, Ur-Zababa tried to have Mr. X killed. When his first attempt was thwarted by Inanna, the king sent the cupbearer to Lugal-Zaggisi with a tablet basically saying, "Please kill this guy." But Inanna saved him again. Tipped off to the plot, Mr. X returned up north, overthrew Ur-Zababa, and made himself king of Kish. At which point, like many usurpers with shaky foundations, he proclaimed himself the legitimate king, or Sharu-Kenu, which means we can all start calling him Sargon, though for the moment, just Sargon of Kish. Sargon's next obstacle and greatest threat was King Lugal-Zaggisi of Uruk. And as would rapidly become his modus operandi, Sargon went straight for the jugular. He later recorded that he conquered the city of Uruk and destroyed its walls, i.e. the legendary walls of King Gilgamesh. Sargon continued that he was victorious over Uruk in battle, and conquered 50 governors of the king with the mace of Ilaba, and captured Lugal-Zaggisi, king of Uruk, and brought him to the gate of Enlil in a neckstock. In case anyone missed the point, a relief on Sargon's victory stele shows Lugal-Zaggisi in a battle net, being struck with a mace by King Sargon. If Sumer hoped that Sargon had come as a liberator, those hopes were instantly dashed. But like the Greek cities threatened by Philip II, the Sumerians weren't just going to roll over for some uncouth northern strongman. Certainly not without a fight. Sargon records leading his army in 34 battles against major Sumerian cities, including Ur, Umma, and Lagash. And through skill or luck or grim determination, Sargon won every battle. He records destroying the walls of each city he conquered as far as the shore of the sea. At the end of the conflict, Sargon the Cupbearer, Sargon of Kish, was the effective master of Sumer, an accomplishment he celebrated by washing his weapons in the lower sea, aka the Persian Gulf. Then, with the south secured, he turned his attention up north. If the northern cities were banking on their historical relationship with kings of Kish, they were also soon disappointed. Sargon prefaced his northern campaign by visiting the city of Tutul, sited along the Euphrates north of Mari. The city boasted a major temple to the Syrian grain god Dagon, father of the gods and northern equivalent of Enlil. Sargon records that after he bowed down and prayed to Dagon in Tutul, the deity gave him the upper land, Mari, Armanum, and Ebla. The contemporary Mariote king, Ishki-Mari, was either killed or deposed, and his city burned and abandoned. So, sorry again, Amorites, there's another major market totally obliterated. Oh, and if by some chance the city of Ebla hadn't been destroyed by Lugal-Zaggisi, it also fell to King Sargon. From there, Sargon marched west all the way to the Cedar Forest near the Lebanese coast and to the Shining or Silver Mountains, possibly the snow-capped peaks of the Taurus Mountains in central Anatolia. In addition to hurting the Amorite economy, Sargon's northern conquests severely damaged Syria's carefully cultivated trade links with Anatolia, Armenia, and Central Asia. Links only slowly, painstakingly restored under later regional successors. In fact, per Benjamin J. Foster, the subsequent period in Mesopotamia saw a decline in the use of tin bronze, mainly due to the difficulties in obtaining tin. Sargon's main focus was gaining direct access to northern resources, like cedar wood from Lebanon and metal from Anatolia, that could be extracted, carried overland, and floated down the Euphrates. Once this access had been secured, Sargon's attention soon turned back to the opposite end of his holdings. The Persian Gulf also had valuable resources and long-standing Sumerian ties. And even more than the north, it was a critical part of Sargon's plans to secure his empire's future. But before such plans could be enacted, he needed to eliminate a powerful rival, the neighboring kingdom of Elam. Sargon sailed down the Tigris to the Persian Gulf, then up the Karun River to Susa, where he confronted an Elamite army under their king Hishib-Rasini. The Elamites were augmented by the forces of Marhashi, a neighboring kingdom off to the southeast, who'd sent their king's brother, a man named Dagu, along with 2 Marhashi generals. Sargon laconically cuts to the chase, declaring himself conqueror of Elam and Marhashi. At the end of this unprecedented string of military victories, Sargon found himself in control of lands stretching from the northern shores of the Persian Gulf to the mountains of Anatolia, and from the Mediterranean Sea to the Iranian highlands. Much of this was entirely new territory, geographically and conceptually, for a Mesopotamian conqueror. Where King of Kish had implied regional dominance, and Lugal-Zaggisi had claimed all of Sumer, Sargon's ambitions were only limited by what he could conquer and hold. In contrast to his Egyptian contemporary, Pepi I, Sargon's possessions were both more expansive and more ethnically and linguistically diverse, including Sumerians, Hurrians, Subartians, Elamites, and a variety of Semitic peoples. Which is why Sargon is credited with forging the world's first empire. Okay, Sargon, you're king of the world. So what do you want to do first? Well, Kish was where he'd first come to power, and Sargon reports that he changed the two locations of Kish and caused them to be inhabited as one city, suggesting some type of refoundation. He may have also founded another city sited near Kish along the Euphrates, an early iteration of the legendary city of Babylon. But neither of these was chosen to be his new capital. Instead, Sargon picked a Mesopotamian city with little prior history, a city of which, despite its fame, we still don't know the location. Based on ancient sources, it was likely sited along the Tigris at a river crossing just downstream of modern Baghdad. The city was known as Agade or Akkad. Sargon's ruling elite adopted the name, calling themselves and their Semitic language Akkadian, and the lands over which they ruled Akkad, or as we know it, the Akkadian Empire. Though he kept the title King of Kish, Sargon also became known as Sargon of Akkad, and eventually Sargon the Great. Per Foster, Sargon's 56 years of rule, longer than his contemporary Pepi I, saw both extraordinary political, social, and cultural innovations, as well as unexampled cruelty, violence, and exploitation on an international scale. His reign was the template for Mesopotamian kingship for the following 2,000 years, at least until the advent of Cyrus the Great. So it's worth trying to understand what he did, as well as why and how he did it. The broad strokes of Sargon's rule are familiar from countless later conquerors. He just happens to be the first. So, a drive for territory, self-glorification, framing his victories as the will of the gods, and extracting wealth, resources, labor, and exotic goods from conquered or subordinate lands. His only real attempt at winning hearts and minds was in some aspects of his treatment of Sumer. And I've always found the parallel of Rome and Greece pretty apt. Sargon respected Sumerian culture. Akkadians spoke and wrote both languages and worshipped many of the same gods, just with different names. Ishtar instead of Inanna, Shamash instead of Utu, etc. But cultural respect was not a free pass. Just ask the Romans about Corinth. Sargon styled himself anointed priest of An and great Ensi of Enlil, the two most prominent Sumerian gods. He credited Enlil with giving him victory and records purifying his temple at Nippur. But Sargon's actual patron deities were those of his capital, Akkad. The first was Il-Abba, which, fun side note, translates to God Father in exactly the same way as the Roman god Jupiter, or Deus Pater. Sargon claims that Enlil, mightiest of the gods, gave Il-Abba his weapon, and that he, Sargon, conquered 50 governors of Uruk with the mace of Il-Abba. Akkad's other main deity was the goddess Inanna, the Semitic Ishtar, whom the Akkadians worshipped in her martial aspect as Astar Anuitum, or warlike Ishtar. In the legend we touched on earlier, it was Ishtar who protected Sargon and helped him to overthrow Ur-Zababa, and Sargon often called himself Ishtar's emissary. In fact, in later regional memory, the entire Akkadian period was known as the Reign of Ishtar. Per Foster, in addition to his conquests, Sargon wanted to be remembered for three main things: having sufficient resources at his disposal to feed 5,400 men in his service, placing Akkadians in governorships all across his conquered lands, and bringing international trade to his capital. Let's take these one by one. The 5,400 men in his service is likely a tally of the quote-unquote Akkadians, i.e. Sargon's ruling elite. The core was likely men from Kish and other northern cities. They're often described as the world's first professional standing army. And while warfare was definitely part of their role, their portfolio was likely much broader. Which brings us to his second boast, that men of Akkad hold governorships from the lower sea to the upper sea, which is a way of highlighting the lands he controlled and the scope of his imperial patronage. Foster notes that the concept of patronage was foreign to Sumer, but far more common in the north, where it was considered an acceptable means of sharing the wealth. In fact, Akkadian nobles were the first known elites to roll with a posse, i.e. surround themselves with a paid entourage of bodyguards and servants. Sargon's patronage had three main groups of recipients: his governors, the heads of ancient cult centers, and the remaining Akkadian nobles, who he granted lands for their support. The governors, who bore the old Sumerian title of Ensi, performed many of the same functions as the previous rulers of city-states. Their duties included managing land, wealth, personnel, and livestock, upholding the law, maintaining infrastructure, and commanding local troops in time of war. According to surviving administrative records, the empire was largely governed from the major cities, including Akkad, Kish, Adab, Umma, and Girsu. At Eshnunna, in the Diyala River Valley, Sargon also built a huge new Akkadian administrative center. Foster notes that the local governor managed agricultural lands, plowmen, draft animals, and thousands of sheep and goats, along with a staff of some 700 workers. Additional Akkadian administrative nodes would be built by Sargon's successors. Government business was conducted in Akkadian, though Sumerian was retained as the language of religion and high culture. In fact, Akkadian would become the lingua franca throughout Mesopotamia for the next 1,600 years. The heads of cult centers, particularly in Sumer, also had a pretty sweet gig. Not only did they control huge tracts of land and the associated income, but also gardens, herds, flocks, and hundreds of temple personnel. Sargon handpicked, or at least approved, both the high priests and priestesses known as Ens, as well as the temple administrators called Sanghas. He also supplied the labor, tools, transport, and draft animals to work their extensive domains, as well as periodic renovations, dedications, and gifts, which meant that temples had gone from running the show to being fully reliant on patronage. The most famous beneficiary of Sargon's new policy was his daughter, Enheduanna, who was installed as high priestess of the moon god Nana at the southern city of Ur. Like Sargon, Enheduanna probably wasn't her real name. It was a Sumerian name/title she adopted on taking up her new role. Over the course of her own very, very long tenure, she was still in place in her nephew's reign, Enheduanna composed a set of hymns that made her the earliest known named author in recorded history. So just let that soak in for a minute. Her best-known work, the Temple Hymns, is a celebration of dozens of Sumerian gods, their temples, and their cities. Though her motivations may have been pure, it also gave her father a boost in the hearts and minds department. Which brings us to Sargon's third boast, that he moored boats of Maluha, Magan, and Dilmun at the wharf of Akkad. We mentioned Sargon's focus on the Gulf, including Dilmun, modern Bahrain, and Magan, modern Oman, as a source of resources for his empire. The third land he mentions, Maluha, was probably the most important of all, not only as a major supplier of timber, but also for its access to the only known ancient sources of lapis lazuli and tin, the region of the Hindu Kush in Central Asia. In fact, since Sargon had wrecked North Syrian trade routes, Maluha was now the only source for the tin needed to make tin bronze. And just where was this bounteous wonderland of timber, lapis lazuli, and tin? Well, Maluha was the Akkadian name for the Indus Valley Civilization, or IVC, of modern Pakistan and India, which we'll cover right after this short break.
Test, check 1, 2. You know you need unique New York. You know you need unique New York. Does that sound all right? Ah, that's better. You can always tell something's missing when you get isolated results, like AI that's only right for one of your systems. Get AI that can work across your data and applications. Learn more at IBM.com. The AI built for business. IBM.
Whatever the occasion, effortless elegance is right this way. Because Hilton brings you new ways to stay courtesy of the Nomad London. And it doesn't stop at award-winning dining in a space draped in velvet and illuminated by vintage chandeliers. No, this day goes beyond with unparalleled personalized service and attentive hospitality. Oh, and did we mention the Nomad London can be booked using your Hilton Honors points at Hilton.com? Hilton, for the stay.
By the time that Sargon rose to power, the Indus Valley civilization was already centuries old. Per Adam S. Green, as early as 3300 BC, permanent walled mud brick settlements appeared in 5 main regions: the upper and lower Indus Valleys, Cholistan, northwest India, and Gujarat. Per Amanda H. Podani, the combined territory stretched over double the area of either Mesopotamia or Egypt. As far as where the builders originated, Elena Kuzmina suggests that they may have hailed from southwestern Iran and spoke a Proto-Dravidian language related to Elamite. 2600 BC saw the rise of the first major IVC cities, one in each of the 5 main regions. The most famous cities, Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, were sited along the upper and lower Indus, respectively. The cities were built on elevated mounds and were thoroughly planned and laid out. Per Green, Mohenjo-Daro's structures in particular appear to have been constructed over interlocking foundation platforms that conform to streets, private lanes, and a system of water drainage. The effort involved in building these cities suggests substantial societal coordination. Green notes that just one foundation platform at Mohenjo-Daro would have required 4 million person days of labor, or 10,000 builders working for over a year. At the same time, no evidence has yet been found of an IVC ruling class. Per Green, IVC cities lack the monumental tombs, palaces, and aggrandizing art that characterize other early complex societies. Items recovered from IVC burials show only moderate differences in wealth, and most of the homes at Mohenjo-Daro were similar in size and amenities. Homes were grouped into neighborhood blocks, sometimes separated from one another by walls, gateways, ramps, and guard rooms. Based on the layout, it's been suggested that each neighborhood may have housed a different social or political group. The houses in each neighborhood block shared an intricate system of drainage pipes that allowed each home to have its own private bathing platform. What did the population do with their time? Well, the IVC economy was a mix of herding, including cattle, buffalo, sheep, goats, and pigs, along with agriculture, craft production, and long-distance trade. IVC villages were self-sustaining, and in contrast to Mesopotamia, their produce doesn't seem to have been used to support the major cities. Crafts were mainly produced in the home, in both cities and outlying villages, with raw materials, technology, and end products all widely and evenly distributed. All of which makes for an intriguing society. But what got the attention of the Near Eastern powers was the items they offered for trade. The main goods exported or transshipped by the IVC were tropical woods, precious stones, and metals like copper and tin. Per Kuzmina, the IVC established an outpost at Shortugai on the Oxus River to exploit the rich neighboring deposits of lapis lazuli. They also established caravan cities, like Shar-e Sokta in southeastern Iran, to facilitate overland trade. In exchange, the IVC mainly imported barley, wool, textiles, and silver, from Sumer and now from Akkad. The perishable nature of most of these items helps to explain why no Akkadian artifacts have ever been found anywhere in the IVC. By contrast, IVC artifacts have been found pretty much everywhere, from Magan, Dilmun, the Iranian plateau, and all over Mesopotamia. Most emblematic are their distinctive seals, carved from steatite and square in shape, holding images of bulls, buffalo, bison, tigers, elephants, rhinoceroses, and even unicorns, i.e. bulls depicted with a single long horn. Seals had a standardized size and shape and a common set of preferred imagery, but appear to have been produced by many different groups of artisans, as opposed to a single centralized body. Per Podani, images of IVC animals, like the water buffalo and zebu, begin appearing in Mesopotamian art around this time. By contrast, the only Mesopotamian imagery that gained any traction was the Master of Animals motif, though the IVC replaced the usual lions with tigers. A major beneficiary of this back and forth was the Persian Gulf island of Dilmun. Akkad and Meluha were thousands of miles apart, with journeys between them taking months, so a convenient way station along the route provided a great deal of benefit. Podani notes that within a decade or two of Sargon's elevation, a large new city was built at Dilmun, reflecting the economic boom. Interestingly, despite their relative proximity, Dilmun used IVC weights and measures, not those of Mesopotamia. Regardless, the important part was establishing trade, and per Sargon's boast, ships from the distant IVC now moored at the wharf of Akkad. Sargon's monopoly on seaborne trade came at the expense of southern cities, like Ur and Lagash, who'd once relied on it for their livelihood. In a broad sense, the Akkadian burden weighed everyone down. It was only a matter of degree. Per Foster, while northern farmers were forced to sell their lands at a loss, Sumerian cities saw their best lands taken with no compensation whatsoever. And, insult to injury, the wealth extracted from conquered lands was used to build Akkadian monuments, palaces, temples, and administrative centers that loomed oppressively over their conquered subjects. Even temples were cleared of ancient monuments so that Akkadian works, as well as objects obtained through Akkadian valor, could dominate their halls and chambers. Meanwhile, on the streets of the empire, Akkadian elites, wearing fine clothes and makeup, dripping with jewelry, and ringed with posses of guards and attendants, bestrode their conquered lands like gods on earth. It was a system practically designed to breed resentment. And my initial understanding was that Sargon was forced to spend a great deal of time suppressing regional revolts, which would totally make sense. But after taking another hard look at the sources, that take isn't really borne out. In fact, after Sargon's early victories in Sumer, Syria, and Elam, there's absolutely zero evidence of conflict or rebellion for the rest of his very long reign. Which does open up a lot of questions. During this time, did the Akkadian army primarily function as an internal security force? Did they wage regular undocumented campaigns against foreign lands? We know that the army was still formidable at the end of Sargon's reign, as we'll cover in a minute. But how they maintained their military readiness is still a bit of a mystery, at least to me. A later work, The Chronicle of Early Kings, relates that in Sargon's old age, all the lands revolted against him, and they besieged him in Akkad. And Sargon went onward to battle and accomplished their overthrow, and their widespread host he destroyed. The text originates 500 years later, so it's unclear how much weight to give it. But again, even if the end saw violent conflict, the vast majority of Sargon's reign may have still been a time of peace. Well, peace, fear, and a boatload of simmering resentment. After ruling his empire for 56 years, Sargon passed away in 2279 BC, just a year before the last Old Kingdom pharaoh, Pepi II, took the Egyptian throne. If he'd come to power in his early 20s, this would have made Sargon nearly 80 years old when he finally passed away. On news of his death, decades of resentment finally boiled over. Major Sumerian cities, including Adab, Zabala, Umma, Lagash, Ur, and Kazalu, went into open revolt, killing or ejecting their Akkadian governors. It was a major threat to imperial rule, and a test of whether the Akkadian Empire could outlive Sargon's death. Sargon had at least 5 surviving children by his wife, Queen Tashlultum. At some point, he'd chosen his second eldest son, Ramush, to succeed him to the throne. And being a chatty fellow, the new king's happy to tell us just what he did. Ramush, king of the world, was victorious over Ur and Lagash in battle, and struck down 8,040 men. He took 5,460 captives. Further, he captured Kaku, king of Ur, and Ketush-Id, governor of Lagash. Further, he conquered their 2 cities and destroyed the walls of both of them. Further, he expelled 5,985 men from their 2 cities and annihilated them. Over the course of 3 battles, Ramush regained control of Sumer, with a final tally of 54,016 men, including those struck down, captives, and men whom he annihilated. Pretty grim and par for the course, but effectively demonstrating that the Ramush apple hadn't rolled too far from the trunk of the Sargon tree. Though Ramush was compelled to inject a new tick. In several inscriptions, he says something along the lines of, "By the gods Shamash and Ilaba, I swear that these death counts are not falsehoods, but are indeed true." Like, I wasn't questioning your tallies, but now I kind of want to check your math. There's actually one part I get a real kick out of. No, I'm not a psychopath, hear me out. Okay, so remember the centuries of conflict between Umma and Lagash regarding those fertile fields along their frontier? Well, after reconquering both cities, Ramush scratched his chin, gazed off into the middle distance, and announced, "Hey, I've got the perfect solution. How about I take 134,000 hectares of that prime agricultural land and hand it out to my nobles? See, conflict ended. Just call me Ramush the Peacemaker." To rub a bit more salt in the wound, Ramush erected a victory stele showing him knocking down the walls of Lagash and massacring unarmed captives. I'm sure there was much rejoicing. A subsequent challenge to Ramush's rule arose from neighboring Elam. The kingdom was once again allied with Marhashi, who'd raised troops from as far as the Indus Valley, yes, the Indus Valley, and marched on occupied Susiana, which shows that no matter how they were governed internally, the IVC were A, able to raise some kind of army, and B, willing to support some allies militarily. After bringing the Akkadian army to meet this triple alliance of Elam, Marhashi, and the IVC, Ramush recorded the result. Ramush was victorious in battle over Abal Gamash, king of Marhashi. He slew 16,212 men. He took 4,216 captives. Further, he captured Emasini, king of Elam. Ramush also boasts that he tore out the foundations of Marhashi from the land of Elam, likely by campaigning in the Iranian highlands, to the effect that Ramush, king of the world, became ruler of Elam. No further mention of the IVC, who apparently steered clear of future conflicts. Per Foster, the booty from the Elamite campaign was substantial. At the sanctuary of Nippur alone, Ramush dedicated 30 pounds of gold, 3,600 pounds of copper, and 300 slaves. Looted stone bowls, vases, mace heads, and other objects were inscribed with Ramush's name and dedicated to sanctuaries throughout the empire. Ramush also commissioned a life-size statue of himself using the world's most valuable metal, tin. According to an inscription, Ramush made a statue of himself in tin, and it stands before Enlil at his temple in Nippur. He accounted himself among the gods, which is the first time in Mesopotamian history that a king had declared himself to be a living god. Previous Sumerian kings, like Akhenaten of Lagash, had claimed to be the offspring of gods, but Ramush basically turned it up to 11. What was the result of this act of hubris? Well, per Foster, it went down like this. Akkadian nobles carried cylinder seals, either suspended around their necks on lanyards or pinned to their cloaks. Sometime in Ramush's 9th year, someone either used the cord to strangle the king or stabbed him with the long, sharp pin. Either way, the historical tradition is that Ramush was assassinated by courtiers using cylinder seals. We know zero additional details, who did it, why they did it, etc. All we know is that Ramush was succeeded by his older brother, Manish-Tushu. In contrast to his brother's experience, Manish-Tushu's elevation went completely smooth, which you can probably attribute to Ramush's brutal crackdown on rebel cities 9 years earlier. In an effort to shore up his reign and diffuse whatever tensions had led to his brother's murder, Manish-Tushu purchased over 3,000 hectares of farmland from 1,000 subjects and transferred it to 50 key Akkadian nobles. The details were inscribed on the very first obelisk raised in Mesopotamia, made of blackstone diorite from the Persian Gulf. And it was toward this region that the new king turned his attention. Manish-Tushu records that he had warships cross the lower sea, likely to the region of Magan. He continues that The cities beyond the sea, 32 of them, assembled for battle. But Manishtushu was victorious. This was likely not a naval battle, for which we don't have records until much, much later, but a case where Akkadian troops were ferried by boat to fight in a land engagement. In his own words, after he defeated local forces, conquered their cities, struck down their rulers, and plundered the silver mines, Manishtushu quarried the black stone of the mountains beyond the lower sea, loaded it on ships, and moored them at the wharf of Akkad. Like his brother Ramush, the king then made a statue of himself, this time of blackstone diorite, and dedicated it to Enlil at Nippur. There was a long Sumerian tradition of placing inscribed statues in temples, allowing kings to pray continuously while they attended to matters of state. Per Foster, Akkadian statues basically serve the same purpose, depicting kings in perpetual prayer and placed in temples for that purpose. Manishtushu decided to run with the concept, mass-producing diorite statues of himself, each inscribed with a standard text, and shipping them off to temples all across the empire. Per Foster, the statues allowed him to promulgate his image, proclaim his deeds, and show his respectful relationship with the local deity, all in one convenient package. It reminds me of the similar program of the pharaoh Pepi I, to keep his image fresh in people's minds. Manishtushu's only other recorded campaign was his conquest of Anshan and Shirahum in the Iranian highlands. Apart from the obelisk and these two campaigns, Manishtushu left few surviving records. A few lines on a mace head here, a door socket there, etc. He may have built new temples to Ishtar at both Nineveh and Assur, though the latter may have been built by King Sargon. Foster proposes that, much like his father, most of Manishtushu's reign may have been peaceful and devoted to imperial consolidation. But after ruling for 15 years, Manishtushu was also killed in a palace conspiracy. Okay, one for the suggestion box. Maybe make the cylinder seals less pointy, or keep them in some kind of fanny pack. I know, Monday morning quarterbacking. In the wake of Sargon's legendary reign, the relatively brief tenures and violent ends of both of his sons did not bode well for his empire. And in 2255 BC, everything rested on the shoulders of Manishtushu's eldest son, the Akkadian crown prince, Naram-Sin. Would you like to listen to ad-free episodes of The Ancient World and a bunch of other great history podcasts? Then go to The Ancient World podcast on Apple Podcasts and subscribe to Airwave History Plus. You'll get a free 7-day trial to listen to ad-free episodes, bonus content, and more from the largest collection of history podcasts anywhere. So subscribe to Airwave History Plus on Apple Podcasts today.